Hello, thank you for joining us today and welcome to the ESHA webinar based around tailoring your nutrition facts. My name is Ben Miller and I am here with Alicia and we're going to go through that topic today. Before we get into the topic, we'll give you a little bit of background on ESHA research. ESHA was established in 1981 as one of the very first nutrition software solutions. Today we provide a number of solutions including product development, nutrition labeling, nutrition analysis, and regulatory compliance. And we have our applications Genesis R&D Food, as well as Genesis Supplements and the food processor. And we have consulting services as well. Today we're going to look at the Genesis R&D Food application. Genesis was released in 1991 and was designed to help users manage processes and industry challenges and meet federal requirements for nutrition labeling and packaging. You can do product development, formulation, menu analysis, reporting, and regulatory compliance. We have a couple upcoming webinars after today. In a couple of weeks. On a Tuesday, we're going to have a advanced label settings overview that's going to go through the advanced label section of the Genesis application, creating dual declaration labels, aggregate labels, multiple label formats for a single recipe, and so forth. And then on March 13th, we're going to have creating and customizing your nutrition label statements. And that's going to go through the ingredient and allergen statements within the Genesis application, how to tailor those to your needs and customize them. Please note, as always, this webinar is being recorded. All of our webinars are available on our website. And if you do have any questions during the webinar, you can submit a question inside of that control panel. And we'll try to answer that as best we can during the webinar. Or if we don't get to, you can always reach back out to our sales or support teams, depending on what that question is about. And for today, we're going to take a look at overall kind of based around the label settings area. So within a recipe, going into edit label and taking a look at all of those different format options and take a look at a few examples as well. With that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to my colleague Alicia. She's going to walk you through all that information.
Thank you, Ben. Yes, today we are going to talk about the various label edits that you can make to accommodate your product packaging, your marketing needs, and your audience. Here are some examples of some labels that you can prepare in Genesis R&D. Here we have the old and the new US label formats. You can see the 1990 and the 2016 label formats. You can notice here that there is not only formatting differences, but content differences as well. We have additional format labels. Here are some US examples with the standard vertical, the tabular, and the linear labels. These help you address the needs for different packaging shapes and sizes. Genesis also has several modules that help you work with US labels or other countries. We have Canadian labels, Mexico labels, and EU labels. And each of these formats are built to their respective countries' regulations. The Canadian label, just a note on that it is available in the 2003 and the 2016 formats. And a few additional options available, and we'll cover many of these today, but as an example with US labels, Canadian labels also do the same in many countries, allow you to include additional voluntary nutrients. So if you need to report additional vitamin and mineral content, you can certainly do so on the label. And here's an example of a US bilingual format. So this is providing English and Spanish information on a US formatted label. Just a note, as you saw on the previous slide, the Mexico label looks very different. The US bilingual label is an English, Spanish, US regulation label. They're driven by different regulations. So let's jump into Genesis. We can show you some of these labels in action. So to make changes to your labels in Genesis, you want to open a recipe. And I'm going to view the label, choose view label, just so we can see as we're working along some changes that may occur. Today's features will be selected from the edit label set of features. And you'll see here many features available, many options available. We're going to discuss these top 5 tabs You'll see here supplement facts panels are available in the Genesis Food. Just a word on that. The Genesis Food program includes supplement facts panels for food type labels or food type products, as opposed to our separate program, Genesis Supplements. That's geared for more formulating and creation of labels if you work with tablets, pills, powders, those kinds of supplements products. And we do have specific webinars that address supplement facts labeling. So like I said, you'll see many options within any of these tabs. We'll start with the general. General starts with the regulation, so that's essentially the country that you're working with. And I do want to mention that Genesis is a powerful and convenient tool to help you create your nutrition facts labels. We have various options with all of these different countries, and all of these options offer great flexibility, but I do want to remind you that it's critical that you understand the regulations of each country you work with and select the proper options to create compliant labels for your products. Have a review process in place so you can check to make sure that you have selected the correct options for your labels. As an example, you'll see my visible label here. This is not a compliant label. It's missing some key information that's required in the US regulation, like the serving size information. So depending on the country that you're working with, you can select from the regulation options. Mine is set to the US labels, but I could also choose Canada, Mexico, or EU labels from here. This is a default setting, or you can select a default setting. My particular Genesis is set to US 2016 label, and you can adjust that depending on your preferences. So let me just jump out of the label settings really quickly and show you where you would find that. So in Home and Preferences, you'll see the second option is the regulation, and from here you can set your default setting. So again, mine is selected as the US 2016, but it could also be the 1990 or the various Canadian labels, Mexico or EU. And then to get back to my edit recipe, again, recipe, and then edit label. The category relates to the regulation that you have selected. So here, again, with my US label selected as my regulation, these are the various labels that I can select within that. So I could work with my nutrition facts panels for food products, either the 1990 or the 2016, or I could work with supplement labels and select that setting from here. The label tab, think of this as the various age groups that you could work with. We also have dual column choices there. I'm not going to talk about dual column today. We will be covering that in a separate webinar. And the style, think of that as the shapes or sizes. So again, with US labeling, we have various shapes that you can work with. Here's the tabular label. You can also select the linear from there. And format, we have the full, for US labeling, the full or the simplified label. And again, just to meet the needs that you might need for your packaging or the content of the information that you're presenting. When you're working with this general information, whatever regulation and category you have selected may affect these general lines or options that are shown down below. For instance, in this case, I have the US 2016 label selected. So my options down here do relate to that. There's a dual column option here that we added to address the rack requirements of a single serving versus a full container. You can do a dual column label for that. So it's just helping put that information right where you need it. And the serving size information and servings per container is also selected in this general section because they apply to many of the labels. There are countries where, or some of the countries' labels, you can present just a 100-gram label, so it will pull that information from your recipe. But in the case of the US and Canada, we often have our serving size and servings per container, or portion size information in a friendly household measure. You can see that information is missing from mine, so let me show you how to add that. So for serving size, I just expanded the options under serving size, and you'll see these 3 separate lines. If you click in the right-hand column, this is just a text field. So I can enter the information, that friendly household serving information that I would like to include on my label. And here, since I have this field open anyhow, I'll just add the French and the Spanish translations. We'll work with some of those labels as well, so I'll just add them now. You will see there's a hide calculated serving size, so the default is by gram. There's also a serving size unit measure that you can change. So if you were labeling a liquid product, a beverage, say, you wouldn't show the gram weight for that, you would show it in milliliters. And then you could also type up here so many fluid ounces, 12 fluid ounces, and have the corresponding milliliters. So again, for servings per container, follow the same thought of expand the options, type in our number of servings per container, and in this case also populate the French and Spanish, even though they're the same. There are options of labels where you can hide the servings per container, such as a single serve pack, where you wouldn't need to say 1 serving per container necessarily. So you can hide servings per container. I'll just click OK, and we can see how that information automatically populated where it's supposed to be and has friendlier language on our label. So format options, again, just a general overview of this section of the label and how to think about it when you're looking for choices on your labels. Think of the format options as general choices that you can make to include or hide information on your label. So general abbreviations, general abbreviations, the footnote information. You'll also see here uppercase and uppercase options for ingredient statement and allergens. That's just kind of an easy formatting, so you don't have to worry about uppercase and lowercase. We'll talk about ingredient statements and allergen statements in a separate webinar, but just wanted to show you where that was. And then options in working with your label. So if you need to move, place the vitamins and minerals in 2 columns versus 1, hide trans fat, if it's not needed on your label, italicize trans fat, just for your preference, and other options. The nutrient options, again, relate to what's available, what you can report on the label. So there are that set of mandatory and voluntary nutrients for the US, core and additional nutrients for Canada. Most countries have a core set or a smaller set that is required, and then additional nutrients that may be voluntarily declared. So the nutrient options include display and rounding options specific to the nutrient. Not all of these nutrients have the same options. Let me show you a few. Added sugars, you can see here that there are display options of how the words should appear on the label, and that's to work with the size of the label that you may have or room available on your packaging. You can also see rounding rules, or if it's deemed insignificant, you can indicate that added sugars would still be displayed in its proper place on the label. Calcium in comparison, again, has rounding rules and show even if insignificant. This round to the nearest tenth, again with the newer labels, we have to show quantitative values for these vitamins and minerals at the bottom of the label rather than just the percent daily value. So rounding to the nearest tenth helps us work with the quantitative values and having those in line with the percent DV. And calories, again, various options on how you might display the wording, calories, total calories, etc. Rounding rules. And then here's one that we are often asked about, the calorie calculation method. So the default setting in Genesis is to take the calories reported for each ingredient and total that value, and that is typically the calories that you would see on your label per serving, whatever the serving size is. And so that is a rounded number. The question we get is, I calculated my calories and I'm not coming up with the same number that Genesis is showing for my calories on my label. And this is because there are 6 different methods that the USCFR allows for calculating calories. The 449 method is a commonly used method, and that's what most folks use to calculate. When they're doing this comparison, they'll calculate using 449. So that is an option within these label settings to switch to calculating to the 449 method to come up with this calories value on the label. Sometimes if you select the default, the total of all ingredients, or switch to the 449, this calories value will change just depending on the underlying protein, carbs, and fat information that's driving the 449 calculated value. So just be aware that that can change if you select the other method. And then another nutrient that we're often asked about and that takes even additional consideration is protein. So on the US label, by default, the percent daily value for protein is not reported on an adult label. It's not required, but it can be reported voluntarily. There are circumstances where it is required, such as if you make a claim for protein on your packaging, you would have to present the percent DB for protein. To do so, you do need to check the show percent DB protein. And then there are a couple fields that you would need to fill in. If you're working with an infant label, you would fill in a PER and working with your infant formatted label. And just see how, if I click on this field, then it tells us a little more about the PER. The PER is needed to report percent DB for protein on infant labels, and that value should be between 0 to 2.5. For a child label, ages 1 to 3, or for adult labels, if you want to report the percent DB for protein, you need to fill in a PDCAS. And again, clicking on this line, it gives us a little more description about the PDCAS. It's needed for children and adult labels, and that would be a value between 0 and 1. So I'll just enter in a PDCAS. And I've selected show my protein, percent protein on the label, and it's calculated according to that PDCAS. And again, I'll just show you. If this was complete protein, the numbers would work out a little differently. So 4 grams based on that 50 gram recommendation for protein comes to 8%. But if my PDCAS is less than 1, it's going to adjust that percent DB accordingly. And then the tab for voluntary nutrients, all those others that you can legally display on your label, again, driven by the regulation that you have selected and by the category, you can choose from this list. If I have the 1990 set of nutrients selected, then these will appear differently. So note here, vitamin A is a voluntary nutrient on the 2016 label, and it's reported in RAEs, or micrograms of RAEs. If I change my category to the 1990 label, then I can see this list of voluntary nutrients has changed to meet the 1990 regulations. Vitamin A is no longer available in this voluntary list because it's mandatory on the 1990 label and would automatically show up on that label. But I do have additional voluntary nutrients in the units of measure that are appropriate for that regulation. And then object properties. This relates to the information that is essentially displayed on this label display report. So it helps you work with setting some consistent placement locations of these various pieces of the report. So like the title or the date, the label, those have specific options. You can select a font for your label here. You can select the position in this label display report, and many other options. There is an apply label settings to existing labels that essentially kind of helps you set a template, if you will, and then apply that to newly created labels. There are also images fields where you can bring in artwork to this report. So many adjustments just to customize it. So let's work through a bit more of the options that you can have for labels. And here again, you can see that we created just a basic US standard nutrition facts label. I've added my servings per container and my serving size. And let's work through a few more of these just to customize this label a bit more and make it our own. So I will choose the italicized trans fat. And I'm going to select the, sorry. Let me switch it back to my 2016. So italicized trans fat is available for both 1990 and 2016. I'm going to select this Use FDA draft guidance for nutrient rounding. So again, when the 2016 regulations came out and quantitative values were now required on most labels, along with the %dV, we run into some rounding options. So here, if you see iron is listed as 1 milligram, let me just apply these settings. And it's showing now trans fat is italicized like I selected, and iron has changed to 1.5. That's based on the underlying, the raw data for this label. And so it's just adjusted with a slightly different rounding, slightly different math behind it. And the nutrient options, again, I'm going to check and make sure that I wanted to use the 449 method, so that is selected. And for folate, I'm going to check the show folic acid in parentheses following folate. So again, on the 2016 label, if I choose to show folate, then I can also include the folic acid information. So I've selected the formatting from the nutrient options, but to select folate on my label, I need to go to voluntary nutrients and add that. And also, because this is a bread product, I'm going to select some of my B vitamins and apply those changes. So here you can see B vitamins showing up, folate has folic acid, and a few of those other settings that I've selected. Then again, going back, I've built my label, but I've discovered that my packaging size needs to accommodate a different shape. So I can go back to my general settings and select a different style to work within the available size that my packaging will provide. I'm going to switch that back and just talk about the full versus simplified label briefly. So the simplified label is based on the content of the product. It's not on the available space of the packaging, as is the case with the tabular and linear labels. Nutrients that are considered insignificant can be grouped together in an insignificant statement down at the bottom of the label. On the US label, adult label, if 8 or more of mandatory nutrients can be considered insignificant, then the simplified label can be used. For some nutrients, insignificant means 0, and for others it means less than 1. And then calories and fat, carbohydrates, and protein, as well as sodium, are always listed up here in the top section. But you can see here it places the insignificant statement down below. And if I were to count these, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, I only have 6 nutrients listed down below in the insignificant statement. But then again, total fat counts towards those 8, as well as sodium, and they qualify, help this label qualify. So a simplified label could be used based on that. I'll go back to my full, and again, just show you with age groups. If I were to select an infant label, you will see some formatting and some nutrient, mostly formatting changes. So with infant and child labels, there are different recommendation sets that help calculate the %dVs. Same quantitative values might be reported with a child or an adult label, but the %dVs would calculate differently. And then in some cases, in the infant label, the %dV is not displayed for particular nutrients. So Genesis formats that for you. And then again, if we just take a look at additional country labels, I'll show you a Canadian label. Places it in the proper formatting. This is showing English only. So if I go back to my format options and show bilingual, then you'll see both languages and presented in the proper information. You can change your language order. So if you wanted French to come first, English second, you can certainly change the primary and secondary language options. And again, a Mexico label formats it properly. I've still got my voluntary nutrients, so those are showing up. But format options are driven by the Mexico regulations, as shown there. And while we're at it, we'll just show one more, cover them all with the EU label. Again, you can see that looks quite different. The default setting for an EU label would just show the per 100 gram, but then you can also choose to show the proportion. And here it's based on one slice. So that covers the content of the labels, and we can jump into some question and answers, but I'll have Ben just make a few more comments.
Perfect, thank you, Alicia. Before we get into those questions, I know we had quite a few. It looks like we do have a few training sessions coming up if you want some more advanced training and information. All 4 of our next trainings will be at our Oak Brook ESHA training facility. It's going to be February 15th and 16th will be a professional training. The 21st and 22nd, actually the first one is tomorrow and the next day, isn't it? The 21st and 22nd is an advanced workshop. And then we have a professional and advanced March 21st and 22nd, and then April 11th and 12th. And again, before we get into some of these questions, if we don't get to your question today, feel free to reach out to us if you have questions about support of the application or nutritional type questions. You can contact support@esha.com or call us at that 503 number listed there. Support is extension 4. Had to think about that one for a second. Now we'll get into a couple of questions here. Our first question, I switched from the 1990 to the 2016 label. I didn't see my formula, but my percent DVs, I didn't change my formula, but my percent DVs are different. Why is that? Can you address that one, Alicia?
Absolutely. Yeah, so again, the underlying recommendations for the 1990 labels for US versus the 2016 labels did change. Many of the, so say like for fat, for instance, where it used to be 65 grams in the 1990 label, the recommendation changed to 78 grams for an adult. And if you have the 1990 label displayed, make no changes to your formula, and then switch to the 2016 label, you can see some percent DV changes just based on that. Let me just show you here. Let me get out of bilingual. So here's my 1990 label, and it's showing percent DVs calculated from these quantitative values. Then if I switch over to my 2016 label, like the total carbohydrate, I believe that changed. So it's just that underlying value that's calculating the percent DV may have changed, and so you could make no changes to your formula and still see differences on the labels. Certainly something to be aware of, and our e-learning web page on the website, the ESHA website, as well as blog articles, really provide a lot of detail about those type of changes. Highlights the mandatory versus voluntary nutrients and the amounts. We have a wonderful chart that lists out the detailed chart of the 1990 values versus the 2016 values.
Great. Next question, which may have a few different answers depending on how you, I guess, kind of look at it. What if I want to present data for both nutrients that are reported on the 1990 and 2016 labels? Is that possible?
Of course it is. And I'll show you, again, just keeping in mind what nutrients were considered voluntary versus mandatory is certainly something to consider. I'm going to clear out my voluntary nutrients here and just talk a little bit. to this point. So again, working within a nutrition label, some of the nutrients that are mandatory now in the 2016 were not on the 1990s, such as vitamin D and potassium. Those were voluntary nutrients before. And if I switch to my label, the 1990 label, we'll see a different set of nutrients in a couple cases. So on the 1990 label, you see potassium is not reported, vitamin D is not reported down below, but vitamin A and C are. And the placement of some of these nutrients is different from one to the next. So I'm going to add potassium and vitamin D to my 1990 label. And I can show you where those end up. Potassium is nested right under sodium, and then vitamin D takes its place down with the other vitamins and minerals. Vitamin D is listed last because it's a voluntary, so the mandatory come first. Again, switching over to the 2016 label. You're not seeing vitamins A and C. I would have to select those from the voluntary set of nutrients. And vitamin A is listed in micrograms of RAE rather than IUs now. Vitamin C is the same. So here, potassium is not listed under sodium. It takes its proper place down below as a mandatory nutrient on the 2016 label, and vitamin A and C are listed as voluntary underneath that. And then I just have a word, I'm putting on my database hat for a minute. In working with data, what we see on websites might not be in nutrition facts format. So if you are reporting information outside of the context of the nutrition facts format, then just give us some clue as to what set of regulations you're using. Here's an example of some confusing presentation, like on a website. So if you listed your nutrients outside of a nutrition facts label and potassium was listed underneath sodium, like on the 1990 regulations, and vitamins A and C were included, again, per the 1990 regulations, but vitamin D was also included, so that's a 2016 mandatory nutrient. And there was no, say, if the nutrients or the vitamins and minerals were only presented as percent DV and not the quantitative values, so we don't have context of what percent DV is driving those, and then throw in added sugars just for fun. This combination without a nutrition facts format could be very confusing. We'd want to see some note saying this is based on 2016 labels or something to that effect, or quantitative values, just more to give us clue of the details and the completeness of the information. Great question, thank you.
Yeah, and one more thing that I'll kind of point out on that topic. You do have to follow one set of rules or the other, though. That's I think one big piece that I've had asked a few times. There's no crossing. You can't use part of one regulation, part of another. You can't add added sugars to the old label, things like that. So you still have to follow the rules for that one set of regulations. It's one or the other, not a combination of both. So it's certainly one thing that I've seen over the last couple of years as these new regulations have come out.
Great point, thank you.
Our next question. I have recipes that have been in my software for a while, and some I have recently added. Which label format will show?
I'll give my take on it, and Ben, please jump in if you need to add anything or correct me. So depending on how long you've had your software, you may have recipes that have existed for some time and were created with the 1990 label format. Then the updates came out and you switched over to 2016 label. So one point driving that is whichever label you have set as your default could affect the new labels or labels for the new recipes that you've added. But anything created before, and Ben can clarify which version it was, if it was 11.1, anything created in that 1990 format will remain until you choose to manually change that over. We didn't think it was a great idea to just suddenly pop in the 2016 label for all of your recipes. Not everyone was ready with the underlying data to support the 2016 labels. So going forward, check out your default preference setting and expect those new recipes to have that, whichever label format you have selected. Did I get it right?
Absolutely. Really, the kind of idea is you have your defaults for new recipes, and that's in your preferences. Any existing recipe has its own preferences for its label specifically, and if you saved that label 5 years ago, that label still has the settings that it had 5 years ago, so it's going to be running under the 1990 regulations and until you change that inside of the specific recipe. So yeah, absolutely. All right, our next question we've got here, if I use a different method, not 449 or how Genesis calculates calories, how do I report those?
Sure. So yes, again, there are several different methods that can be used with US labeling. And so 449 is available within the label settings. But if you needed to adjust, say, for dietary fiber or sugar alcohols and had a slightly different calories calculated, you can certainly override that. So within your recipe tab and edit recipe, if you go to the nutrient setting, there's an override column, and you can certainly enter in manually an adjusted calories value and apply that to your label. That's what will show up on reports and labels.
Perfect. Looks like I think we'll have one or two more. Can you explain more about the apply all settings in object properties?
Ben, I will let you handle that one while I'll display where it's located in the software.
Perfect. And that'll lead into, I think, our last question as well, which is, can I change my default settings for new recipes or new labels as well? So I'll kind of touch on both of those during this, but under the object properties area within the label settings, there's an apply all settings. And the apply all settings button can be fairly dangerous because it will apply all of the settings for your label. So everything in the object properties tab, everything in the format options tab, to every recipe in your entire database. So if you have 1,000 recipes, it will change every single one of those to take all of those settings. That can be a great thing. That can also be, again, like I said, a dangerous idea and a dangerous proposition. So you don't want to go in and just change everything. If you're using the cloud version of the Genesis application, if you do mistakenly click that and realize that that you didn't want to go about that, we do have the ability to restore information from a installed application standpoint. If you back up, you can, but it may be something that's irreversible. So just make sure that you know that you're changing something that may or may not be completely irreversible.
And Ben, is that for your user-specific settings? So if I hit apply all, it would just be for my Genesis?
Right, but it would be across any users within your organization and for all of those recipes. So it's not just the individual user, it is tied to the recipes specifically.
Okay, thank you.
And then the last question that I was going to go into, which we saw a couple of times as Alicia was talking today, was, is there any way to change these specific settings? Is there a way to select a voluntary nutrient and have it always selected for every recipe we create, or change the trans fat to be italicized for every setting? And that's certainly possible as well. At the bottom of the window that Alicia is showing now, we have the save and load settings, and that will allow you to create a label settings file, which you can then use to set your preferences. So you can either save that file for a specific recipe, and that will save all the settings in the general tab, format options, nutrient options, voluntary nutrients, object properties, all of those pieces will be saved. You could then go into a new recipe and load them. So you could maybe have a settings file for a standard, a settings file for a tabular, a settings file for a linear. So you've got all of those different styles available. Or maybe I guess probably both at the same time. You can save that file, and then Alicia, if you could close out this window and go into Home and Preferences. And then under the Label tab, we have a default settings file. By default, that's going to be blank because it just has the defaults that Genesis selects. But if you go in and select one of those label settings files and save it here, it will then change every recipe you ever create to those specific settings. So if you have again, a voluntary nutrient or a specific format option that you would like, or any of those sorts of things that you change, it will be changed for every new recipe. The default settings file is for new recipes only. If you have an existing recipe or all of your hundreds of existing recipes, changing the default settings file won't change those, but it will change moving forward for new things.
Thanks so much. That explains a lot and really shows the power of a few buttons there. Thank you.
Yeah. All right, and that's the last question we're going to get to. If we didn't get to your questions, certainly contact us and we'll try to follow up with as much as we can. Thank you for joining us today and have a great afternoon.